It was our anniversary yesterday. We've been married for 15 years now. Most people might celebrate such a milestone with a fancy dinner or a weekend getaway, but that's never really been our style. Instead, we drove up to Shasta Lake, a quiet escape deep in Northern California, to spend the weekend hiking and camping. My husband Tony grew up in this part of the state, and he'd spent his childhood summers fishing in these waters and hiking the forest trails. It's like second nature to him, being out in the wilderness, surrounded by nothing but the towering pines and the soft sounds of nature. For me, well, I've always been a city girl at heart. I'm Hmong, born and raised in Fresno, where the buzz of cars and people never stops. I love the peace of the forest, sure, but the silence? It unnerves me sometimes. There's something about the deep quiet that makes me feel like I'm being watched. We arrived at the campground just before noon, setting up our tent on the edge of the lake. Tony was already full of energy, talking about how we should hike up to Heart Lake, a small hidden gem nestled deeper into the mountains. I could see his excitement, so I nodded and smiled, even though I knew it would be a tough trek. As the day wore on, the trail turned steeper, and the trees seemed to close in around us. The sun was still shining brightly, but the deeper we went, the darker it felt. The forest had its own rhythm, like it was alive and breathing, watching us. Tony led the way, his steps sure and confident, while I lagged behind, occasionally catching glimpses of the lake through the trees. Every now and then I'd hear a rustle in the underbrush, but each time I looked, there was nothing there. When we finally reached Heart Lake, the view was breathtaking. The water was so still it looked like glass, reflecting the mountain peaks perfectly. We sat at the edge, Tony pulling out sandwiches while I stared at the water. For a moment I could understand why he loved it out here. There was a sense of tranquility, a quiet that you couldn't find anywhere else. As we sat in silence, something odd caught my eye. There were no birds, no ducks on the water, no chirping from the trees. It was like the whole forest had gone still. I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I didn't mention it to Tony, but the eerie quiet gnawed at me. After lunch, Tony decided to take a quick dip in the lake. I stayed behind watching as he waded into the water, the ripples spreading out in perfect circles around him. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches like bony fingers reaching out. My heart started to race for no reason, and I found myself standing up, scanning the tree line. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like something deep and ancient stirring beneath the earth. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder, more insistent. Tony didn't seem to notice. He was laughing, splashing water up into the air like a kid. I called out to him, but the sound seemed to swallow my voice. I took a step toward the lake, my skin prickling with a sudden chill despite the warm afternoon air. Tony turned back to me, his face lit up with joy, but just as quickly, his expression changed. He looked confused, then alarmed. "Yang, get back!" he shouted. Before I could move, the water around him started to bubble, like something was rising from below. Panic shot through me as I rushed toward the shore, but I stopped in my tracks when I saw what emerged from the lake. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. This dark, shadowy shape slowly lifted from the water, towering over Tony. Its form was twisted, almost humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long, its head too large, with glowing eyes that pulsed like embers. Tony tried to swim back, but the thing's long, sinewy arms shot out, grabbing him. I screamed, frozen in place as the creature dragged him under. The water splashed violently for a moment, then went still, too still. My body jolted into action, and I ran. My legs pumped furiously as I tore through the forest, branches scratching my arms, leaves crunching under my boots. My mind was a whirl of terror and disbelief. I could still hear Tony's shouts, the splashing, that creature dragging him down. My breath was ragged, my chest tight, but I didn't stop. I had to get to the car, I had to get out. By the time I reached the car, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys out of my pocket. My heart pounded against my ribs, and the world spun in a dizzying blur around me. I fumbled with the door, nearly dropping the keys in my haste. When I finally managed to unlock it, I jumped inside, my hand on the ignition. Just as I was about to start the engine, the passenger door flew open. Tony collapsed into the seat beside me, soaking wet, gasping for air. I screamed in shock, my heart nearly stopping at the sight of him. His clothes were drenched, his face pale and exhausted, but he was alive. I stared at him, my mind refusing to believe what I was seeing. "I fought it," Tony rasped, coughing up water. "Under the water, it tried to drag me down, but I fought it. I don't know how, but I escaped." His voice was trembling, raw with fear and exhaustion. I couldn't speak. My mind was spinning with questions, disbelief, and relief. I just stared at him wide-eyed, trying to process what he was saying. "Let's go," Tony said, his hand gripping my arm. "Now, we have to get out of here." I didn't need to be told twice. I jammed the key into the ignition, my hand still shaking, and floored the gas. The tires screeched as we sped out of the parking lot, the forest rushing by in a blur of green and shadow. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see. We didn't stop driving until we were well out of the forest, back on the highway, miles away from Shasta Lake. My hands clutched the steering wheel, knuckles white, as I tried to calm my racing heart. Since that day, we've never gone back to the forest. No more camping trips, no more hikes, and definitely no more lakes. Whatever was in that water, whatever Tony fought, it's still there. We don't talk about it much, and when we do, it's in whispers, like saying it out loud might bring it back. All I know is, we'll never go back. Not ever again. Do you ever get that feeling? It's like a shadow is just at the edge of your vision, something or someone that shouldn't be there. You glance around, but it's already gone. Maybe it was just a piece of lint, or the dog, or a flicker of light. You shrug it off and carry on with your day. I've lived in Fresno, California all my life. As a Hmong woman, I grew up hearing stories about spirits, shamans, and the unseen. My grandmother used to tell me to always be careful at night, that spirits like to wander when the air is thick and silent. But I never really believed her, not until the day everything changed. It was late October, a chilly night. I had just moved back home after losing my job, staying in the small house my parents left behind. The backyard had seen better days, overgrown grass and a half-rotted wooden fence. My only companion was my little dog, Chia, who liked to chase squirrels around the backyard. That evening, I was sitting on my bed, scrolling through social media, when I heard a rustling sound from the yard. At first, I thought it was Chia playing, but then I heard a low, guttural growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. I rushed to the window and froze. Standing near the fence was an old man, except he wasn't just old, he was rotten. His skin was hanging off his bones like melted wax, his eyes sunken and black. My heart pounded as I watched him crouch down, his long, bony fingers reaching for something on the ground. "Chia!" I screamed and ran outside, but by the time I reached the yard, it was too late. The man was gone, and so was Chia. All that remained was a pile of torn fur and bloodstains on the grass. In shock, I stumbled back inside, locking the doors behind me. I called a local shaman, one of the elders from my community, to come help. His name was Uncle Pao, and I had seen him work before. He was quiet but powerful, able to communicate with spirits that most people couldn't even see. When Uncle Pao arrived, he brought his tools, a gong, some joss paper, and a small chicken. "There's something here," he said as soon as he stepped into my house. "A spirit has followed you." We sat in the living room, and Uncle Pao began his ritual, chanting in Hmong as the air grew thick and heavy. The temperature dropped, and a cold, unnatural breeze swept through the room. Then we heard it, a faint growl from the corner of the room. Slowly I turned my head and saw him, the rotten man, standing in the shadows, his black eyes fixed on me. Uncle Pao's voice grew louder, more forceful. He threw the joss paper into the air and the room filled with the scent of burning incense. But the spirit didn't leave. Instead, it spoke. "He's not going anywhere," Uncle Pao said. "This spirit, it's tied to you." "Tied to me? Why?" I asked, my voice trembling. Uncle Pao looked at me gravely. "This spirit has been feeding on your fear. It's why he took your dog. You've seen him before, haven't you?" I nodded, remembering all the times I had caught glimpses of something in the corner of my eye, always dismissing it as nothing. "You have to face him," Uncle Pao said. "Only then will he leave you." I didn't know how I was supposed to face something so terrifying, but I knew I had no choice. That night, after Uncle Pao left, I sat in the living room, waiting for the rotten man to return. He didn't make me wait long. The house creaked, and I felt the air grow cold again. Slowly I turned and saw him, standing just a few feet away. His mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing sharp, rotting teeth. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't answer, just stared at me with those hollow eyes. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," I whispered, though my heart was still racing. "You can't take anything from me." For a moment, the room was silent. Then the man's grin faded, and his figure began to dissolve, fading into the shadows like smoke. The air grew warmer, and the heavy pressure lifted from my chest. It was over. The next morning, I felt lighter, freer. Uncle Pao told me that the spirit was gone for good. Chia was lost, but I had faced something I never thought I could. Maybe my grandmother was right after all. Some spirits linger, waiting for their moment, but I wouldn't let them take anything from me again. As I stood in the backyard, the sunlight breaking through the clouds, I smiled to myself. Life had changed, but I was still here, stronger, and no longer afraid of what lurked in the shadows. I sat back on my new couch, staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazily above me. It was early September 2023, and the air in Sacramento still held on to the last traces of summer heat. I had been in California for almost a year now, far from the tight-knit Hmong community I grew up with in St. Paul, Minnesota. Adjusting to the laid-back West Coast vibe had been a challenge, but here I was, making it work one day at a time. The house had been a real project. Between work and unpacking, I'd barely had time to breathe. Last week, I finally finished painting the kitchen a bright turquoise, my favorite color. The fridge, shiny and high-tech, dominated one corner. It could tell you the temperature inside and even play music. But the real pride of my living room was this old vintage recliner I had picked up from a thrift store downtown. It creaked, but was comfortable. A loud buzz from the doorbell shook me out of my thoughts. I shuffled over, yawning as I opened the door. Standing there, wearing a massive grin and a ridiculous Hawaiian shirt, was my cousin Eric. "Didn't think I'd find you in a house like this," he said, laughing as he stepped inside. I chuckled. "Yeah, welcome to my West Coast dream. What's with the shirt? You look like a tourist from the 90s. Eric shrugged. "What can I say? I'm living my best life." He tossed his duffel bag on the couch and flopped down. "Just got in from LA, he said, still smiling. "I'm staying with you for a bit, right?" Yeah. Make yourself at home. I didn't realize you'd be here this soon," he laughed. "Well, surprise." As I headed into the kitchen to grab us drinks, a sudden flash of lightning lit up the room. I glanced at the window. Rain had started to pour down in thick sheets, bouncing off the sidewalk outside. A storm in September. Great. Eric stood by the window, peering out with an odd look on his face. "You see that?" "What?" I handed him a bottle of iced tea. He pointed. "That old guy across the street, he's just standing there." I looked over. Sure enough, there was an old man outside, drenched from the rain but completely still. His face was pale, almost green under the dim streetlight. "They're probably just waiting for a ride," I said, trying to brush off the creeping unease. But Eric shook his head. "Look at his hand." The man's hand was trembling, and as we watched, he suddenly twisted his own neck with a sickening crack, his head turning completely around to face us through the window. "What the hell?" Eric shouted, backing away from the window. My heart pounded. I was about to rush outside when the man stood there, head now facing us, as if he were peering directly into our souls. Then, in a shocking moment, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. I stared, speechless. Did we just... Eric gulped, wide-eyed. Dude, that was messed up. We spent the next hour trying to convince ourselves it was a prank, maybe some weird street performance. But no matter how we spun it, neither of us could shake what we'd seen. Later that night, Eric crashed on the couch and I went to bed. But sleep was hard to come by. My mind kept replaying the twisted scene. Around 3 a.m., I heard Eric get up, mumbling something about needing water. His footsteps echoed down the hall, but after that, there was only silence. An hour passed. I rolled over, expecting to hear him come back, but nothing. Groaning, I dragged myself out of bed to check on him. "Eric?" I called, walking into the kitchen. No answer. The light flickered as I turned it on, casting eerie shadows across the room. I stepped into the living room and my heart dropped. Eric was gone. The back door was wide open, rain pouring in and soaking the floor. A shiver ran down my spine as I hesitated. Something felt wrong. I cautiously stepped outside, squinting into the darkness. The rain fell in heavy sheets, making it impossible to see anything clearly. The yard was empty, not a sign of Eric or anyone else. "Eric!" I called into the night. My voice echoed back at me, but no answer came. Panic surged through me. I turned to head back inside when something caught my eye through the window. I froze. Inside the house, a figure stood in the dim light of the living room. I squinted, trying to make out what I was seeing. The shape was translucent, glowing softly against the dark walls. It looked like a woman, her long hair cascading down her back, her expression frozen in a sorrowful gaze. I stumbled backward, heart racing. "Eric!" I yelled, but all that met my ears was the sound of the rain hitting the pavement. The ghostly figure turned her head toward me, her eyes piercing through the darkness, and I felt an icy chill grip my heart. For a moment we stared at each other, and I knew instinctively that she was trying to tell me something. But then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she faded into the shadows of the room. I rushed back inside, the door slamming shut behind me. "What was that?" I muttered to myself, shaking. I searched the house, calling Eric's name, but there was no response. The ghost's face lingered in my mind, the sorrow in her eyes mixing with a growing sense of dread. I felt like I had stepped into a nightmare, and I didn't know how to wake up. As the night wore on, I tried to distract myself with my phone, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Eric. I picked up a few snacks, hoping he'd come back soon. I waited for what felt like hours, my anxiety growing with each passing minute. Finally, I texted him. "Hey, where are you? You okay?" I watched the screen, waiting for the 3 little dots that would indicate he was typing, but they never appeared. Just then, I heard the front door creak open, and in walked Eric, a wide grin on his face, soaked but buzzing with excitement. Guess what? I met some friends at a bar nearby. They invited me to party with them, so I had to go. My relief was palpable. "You scared me. I thought something happened to you." He waved me off, still smiling. "Nah, it's all good. Just a little adventure." I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my gut. "I don't know, man. It's pretty late and the storm... Come on, live a little. I'll be back in a few hours. Just chill, all right?" He grabbed a towel and headed back outside, laughing as he left. As the door shut behind him, I was left alone in the eerie quiet of the house, the rain still pounding against the windows. I sat on the couch, my heart still racing from the night's events. The ghost's face loomed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking in the shadows. Now, completely alone, I wrapped myself in a blanket, listening to the storm and wondering if the strange figure would return. I felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on me, wondering if I would ever feel safe in this house again.